Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining Disability Innovation Live. I can see there's lots of participants just entering currently, so we'll just hold on for a second or two to let a few more people join the webinar today. So for those of you that joined our previous Disability Innovation Live, this is the second of our sessions, and today's topic will be focused on disability, stigma and the role of innovation. Fantastic, I can see lots of you joining from all over the world, so welcome everybody. So we're going to begin today by just giving you a little bit of information of what to expect from the session and some of the setup. So there are closed captions available, and you can find the options for doing that on your screen by clicking the closed caption option, which is normally placed at the bottom of your screen, slightly dependent on how you've got your computer or your device set up. We have BSL available as well. If you are looking to follow the BSL for this session, the advice is to set your screen up in gallery view. So you do that by, there should be a green bar at the top of the screen, and just next to that green bar there's a button to view options, black button. If you click that and select the final bottom option on that, which is view side by side, and that will enable you to view multiple panelists rather than just the presentation and one. But that functionality is only available on desktops. So if you wish to view more than one person at a time, you'll need to be accessing this webinar via desktop. From a Q&A perspective, there's a Q&A box available for everybody to put any questions they have throughout the session. Please feel free to add as we go through. We'll be coming to answer those questions and those queries you have towards the latter stage of the presentation, but do feel free to input throughout, and we'll try and answer them as we go as well. The session, just so you know, will also be recorded, so we will be making it available afterwards in a number of different formats, and there will also be a full transcript available as well. So Disability Innovation Live, as I kind of previously said, and for people that have already joined the session before, this is an opportunity for us really to share some knowledge and experiences in disability innovation. And it's also to look at the story behind the innovations and the people behind the products. So it's to find out in a bit more depth about different topics and different areas that us as a Global Disability Innovation Hub are working on, and just to show some more information, I guess, and some really interesting stories and experiences from around the world, not just from ourselves, but also from some of our fantastic partners and colleagues who are also doing some really brilliant work in this area. And I guess we're trying to look at, as I said, the stories behind the innovations and the people behind the projects and the products. So just to find out a bit more about some of the work that's happening globally, and get it into a bit more depth around those stories. And it's also a really kind of informal space for ideas and reflections. And for us, it's still quite new. So this is the second session we've had. So we really welcome any of your feedback or your thoughts. And as always with these things, every time we do one, we'll try and make it that bit better and take on all your feedback and ideas that come from it. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the Global Disability Innovation Hub. So we are a research and practice centre driving disability innovation for a fairer world. We were born out of the legacy of the 2012 Paralympics. And we are both a community interest company, but we're also an academic research centre based at UCL. We work in 25 countries, and we'll be aiming to reach 15 million people by 2022. And I guess our projects and programs cover a really vast array of work, from everything from assistive technology right through to arts and culture. And we also do quite a lot of work in inclusive design. So the idea of this Disability Innovation Live series is really just to get in a bit more depth from some of these topics, and explore from different people's perspectives and different people's expertise, I guess, some of the detail of these huge broad areas that we work across. So we're going to be joined today by Vicky, Julia, Mark and Anastasia, and I will leave each of them to introduce themselves as they begin to do their presentation. The setup of the session today is we're going to hear a little bit about these 4 very different areas of work from our panelists today, and then we're going to have some, I guess, a bit more of a discussion around some kind of wider open questions around the topic before we come to some of your own kind of Q&As that you provide throughout the session. So I'm going to hand across to my colleague Vicky Austin, who's going to give us a little bit of introduction into disability and stigma, and also introduce herself.
Thanks, Louise. Lovely to talk to you all today. This is terrifying, so much harder than a real life presentation. So forgive me if I make a mistake, but it's really great to see so many people here. Friends, old and new. There's some people I spot on the list that were there in the beginning for us of GDI, and some people like Ume that were very helpful in the middle, and some people that we work with now. Last time we had over 180 participants from 34 countries. So I hope today we have as diverse an audience, and I hope that the live sessions are accessible to everyone that's trying to reach them. So I'm Vicky Austin. I'm the head of, actually, I'm the CEO of GDI Hub, but I was the head of Paralympic Legacy for London 2012. I worked for 10 years for 3 different mayors of 3 different political persuasions in London, and 2012 was where the idea and the kernel of GDI Hub started to grow between myself and Ian McKinnon. The GDI Hub way, if you like, emerged from the innovation that took place around London 2012, and it became the driver for our kind of ambition about what was possible if you bring together determined people and creative missions to fight for justice. And it lit my passion for trying to address issues of disability justice, which I've been committed to for 20 years, but in new and invigorating ways. And so this session is a really exciting opportunity for me to tell you a little bit of a story of the case study of 2012 around stigma, and to kick off this discussion where our partners will tell you many more stories about the way in which innovative approaches to stigma around disability can transform. There's lots of work, academic and other, out there to talk about what stigma is and to describe stigma, and Mark will talk a little about some of that. But actually this session is really focused on what we can do about it and how we can overcome it. And that is the GDI way. How do we find new solutions to entrenched problems? So I hope you enjoy the session and see it very much as a conversation in a cafe with your friends. Next, please. So the billboard on the image, for those of you that can see it, is a picture that was taken by me. So that's the quality of the image, on the 12th of August 2012. It was the day that the Olympics closed. It was the end of the Olympics for London, and the billboard is just outside of the Olympic Park. So you see in the background the ArcelorMittal Orbit, which now has an accessible slide, as well as the stadium and the aquatic centre. And then in the foreground is the bright pink signage that anyone that was in London 8 years ago this week will have been very familiar with, because it guided disabled and older tourists and participants around the Olympic Park and actually the city. But this poster was important because I saw it exhausted, leaving work on the last day of the Olympics. We'd worked so hard and we had so much to look forward to. Many host cities would have been ready to relax. They'd done a great job. The Olympics was amazing. It's time to rest, but not London, not Channel 4, and not our city, because we knew as soon as we saw this kind of tongue-in-cheek billboard from Channel 4 spring up around the city that we weren't at the end of something, we were at the beginning of something. This campaign, when I first saw it with the words, "Thanks for the warm-up," was such a change in tone to the way the Olympics and Paralympics had ever been delivered before. It shocked me. I laughed and then I cried, because I realised that we'd done something, a little part of what we'd hoped for. We'd switched a little bit of the tone and the narrative around disability. I don't pretend it will last forever. I don't pretend that we did everything, but we did something. And coupled together with the Superhumans campaign, which received some criticism from disabled people, but also challenged a lot of people's perceptions of disability. And the amazing work done by Unlimited, the arts programme in London, led by Jo Verren, in part, she still leads the Unlimited programme and is on our board. This kind of coming together of what it meant to describe and concern yourself with disability in London as a positive thing, as an opportunity for celebration and excitement. It was the first time that kind of slightly cocky, confident tone had been taken, and it sparked change. It turned on its head. It gave a new opportunity to the voice of inclusion and for disability justice. And shortly after, London 2012 Paralympic Games sold out for the first time ever. We had more athletes from more countries than ever before, more television coverage, and our Paralympians became heroes around the world for the first time. It was the most successful Paralympic Games ever, but it was also the most accessible Olympic Games ever, and that shouldn't be forgotten. Next slide, please. But I wouldn't want you to think that this spark that in some ways turned traditional, intractable stigma on its head, or the opportunity that overturning it provided, would have been enough alone, or would have been possible without a long, hard slog. It wouldn't. And that long, hard slog didn't start on the 12th of August 2012. It started in 2005. When a city bids for an Olympic or Paralympic Games, as I said on the IOC video they've just made, they get a chance to choose what type of city they want to be, how they want to be known, what's their mission, what are they for? And London chose to be for the inspiration of a generation of young people and accessibility and inclusion. And those ideas were hard baked into everything London did, from the bid through to the surprising win in Paris, through to the delivery of the event. And I am reflecting more and more as I think about our work now in 24, 25 countries, about what enabled that change. What was the fire that we had to build that was possible for the spark to light it? And so this methodology, which is very much a work in progress, in fact, this is the first time I've put it on a slide publicly, so comments on a postcard / email to me, please. It involved hard work. First, it involved a really bold, well-scoped mission, which was clearly and repetitively communicated about what type of relationship with disability London wanted to have. Second, it involved political leadership from 3 different mayors. Third, our objectives were clear at a programme level, so everyone knew what they had to do, and they were managed. We had really open partnerships, so everyone, be they a child in a school in Newham being taught the Paralympic values, or the Mayor of London, who was Ken Livingstone, then Boris Johnson, then Sadiq, were able to understand what they needed to do to make disability inclusion a reality. We had skilled and diverse teams. I hope I was slightly part of one of them. But it was necessary for everyone to have technical assistance to know what to do, whether they were a private sector company bidding for work or the group responsible for security on the park. We encouraged innovation, and actually Ian was part of the team that designed a new pool lift prototype. Not the one that went in, but the one that came second. And so kind of thinking about how, for example, disabled people get in and out of a pool was something quite new. We had data and reporting that took account of disability so that we could measure our programs and our success. There was lots of media engagement and success was championed, but there were also consequences to failure. Senior people lost their jobs if they didn't take this seriously, and that mattered. And community engagement, and I don't just mean with disabled people, but disabled people and the communities of East London was present at every stage. And clearly Lord Chris Holmes, our primary chair, our first chair, was the Director of Paralympic Integration. So the leadership of disabled people through the process was essential. Next, please. So that was our little case study, our story, our kind of fire that we built over nearly 10 years. The pieces, the twigs, the wood, I'm probably extending my analogy too far, that we needed to pile together so that it was ready to light. And then the light, the touch paper, the cultural shift that enabled that fire to burn at London 2012 when the kind of campaign lit and the attitudes shifted. That for me was the importance of our story, and that's something, that kind of spark of change that can continue to be sought now. We know a broad coalition as well as a long-term plan is important. And for me, to conclude, disability innovation means building that fire, especially now when times are hard and funding is short and COVID is really difficult. Now's our time to build the fire and to put in place the long-term change that we need by developing the tools and the partnerships and the networks. And that's what we intend to do. And we hope that you'll join us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Vicky. I think that's really, really interesting. And for me, the elements that come through really strong there is around the importance of building momentum, and actually how a kind of one-off event such as the Paralympics has such a large impact, not only during the potential event itself, but also followed on from that. But actually, I guess it's more than just the concept of this one-off event. Actually, it's around that what strategic thinking and strategic approach needs to be put in place from the starting point to really enable the best outcomes and the biggest impact for not just those involved, but also a much wider cultural, I guess, change in how people are kind of absorbing that information, but also how they go about their daily lives and their daily activities. So I think it's been really fascinating hearing about all of those, and how such a major moment, I guess, in the culture of London and of the UK has really been a starting point for something much bigger, and something that we're continuing, I think, to grow and take forward and really build upon. So I think that's a really great point, just to hand across now to our second speaker today. So we're going to go and hear from Dr. Mark Caro. Mark, I'll leave you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your area of expertise.
Thank you, Louise. So my name is Mark Carew. I'm senior researcher at UK-based disability organisation Leonard Cheshire. So we work in over 54 countries to advance disability rights. And really in the next 7 or so minutes, I'm going to tell you a quick story about what innovation in stigma and discrimination research has looked like in the past. Which stigma and discrimination is one of my research areas at Leonard Cheshire. So I'm going to cover what it looked like in the past, what innovation in that area looks like now, underpinned by some of our work from Leonard Cheshire. Next slide, please. So, I mean, first of all, imagine that you're a non-disabled university student in the 50s, 60s or 70s, when a lot of the initial stigma research was done. You sign up to a research study on stigma, and you're paired with a disabled person, and the study looks at how well you complete tasks with them, so cooperation being a hallmark of a positive attitude. Well, chances are that the other person would actually be a non-disabled confederate, another student pretending to be disabled at the direction of the experimenter, to give the experiment a bit more of the control in terms of the research design. So a modern equivalent of that, looking at stigma, is to simulate an interaction between different social groups with computers. So perhaps the person on the other end of that is an AI, or perhaps it's a non-disabled confederate. Again, it doesn't matter. Such research designs, they're scientifically innovative, but they're not inclusive. A more inclusive and natural approach to investigating disability stigma would start by asking disabled people about their experiences of it. Next slide, please. So it might surprise some of you to learn that this has not been a common approach historically in prejudice research. So if we take one of the best known and empirically supported prejudice interventions, contact, that's the idea that having interactions, and particularly friendship with people who are different to us, changes the attitude to the wider social group. And when you look at all the 515 studies done on contact interventions from 1954 to the year 2000, it shows both that disability is an understudied context for stigma, with just 76 studies. But the real kicker is that only a handful of these studies look at the perspectives of disabled people. So with a body of research like this, you can say, okay, contact with disabled people changes non-disabled people's minds. But the problem is that it's not known how the same interaction was experienced by the disabled group. Was the same interaction viewed positively? Next slide, please. And let me tell you that these experiences often diverge in real life. So people with disabilities will know the behavior of invasive advice. So that's where somebody offers some well-meaning but unsolicited suggestions. So they might come up to you on the street. So one I've had personally is try some spray to fix that. Well, I've got cerebral palsy. It's a neurological impairment. It's not a mosquito bite or something. So when that happens, you've got a choice to confront or avoid prejudice. But we disabled people, we're important and we're busy. So often we might not just go along with the comments to end the interaction quicker. So the non-disabled person goes away thinking, what a friendly bunch disabled people are. I might talk to more of them, and actually that shows what a helpful person I am. But for me, my experience, I haven't had a nice encounter at all. So intergroup interactions like that, they're fraught with misperceptions and miscommunication. So very robust academic literature around that. So the best research approaches will seek to look at both the majority and minority group perspectives, ideally in the same study, at least in the same research program. So in doctoral and postdoctoral work, I did research like that. We conducted what I think is the first empirical test of the impact of naturally occurring exposure to Paralympic media among both non-disabled and disabled people. And we found some evidence of a positive attitudinal shift. But we didn't find substantial group differences, but it's important to check that, because just because an intervention may have a positive impact on non-disabled people's perceptions of interactions, we still need to check if that links up with disabled people's experiences as well. Now, next slide, please. Now we have another innovation mandate, and that is to ensure that the process of research is disability inclusive. So the research must be inclusive across the life cycle of evidence generation, and that's from planning through to methodology, right through to dissemination. And that's a rights issue. Like infrastructure and services, any research study must be accessible to all disabled persons who are eligible and might wish to participate. And also decision-making about what research to do and how to do it and what to say about it must involve disabled people. And that makes the research better. So for example, in our GDI Hub funded research for AT 2030, looking at overcoming stigma towards assistive technology in Kenya, our starting point to plan the research was talking to DPOs. And that revealed some insights, such as it's not the intrinsic quality of assistive technology, like its shape or its size, although that might play a role, that predicts stigma or causes concern about stigma. It's the fact that the use of AT, the perception of that for some disabled people is that it makes something about ourselves visible, and it's particularly how the worries and the concerns about how non-disabled people might interpret that different. So with that, I'm mindful of the phrase that as commonly said by non-disabled people, that wheelchair bound, whereas disabled people commonly think, okay, what's trapping about a wheelchair? It's enabling, it's what is used to go places and participate in society. Next slide, please. So disability inclusive design, research design is a rights issue, but it's also an innovation mandate. So take COVID-19. It's made science go fast, but our business as usual research practices are disrupted. We have to find new ways to ensure that disabled people are included throughout research. So for example, in remote COVID-19 evidence generation. And that's what LC's DFID-funded Innovation to Inclusion Employment Program did. Our immediate reaction to COVID-19 was to say, okay, how can disabled persons organizations lead this process? So we implemented a research study in Kenya and Bangladesh, which was led by DPOs, and you can read more about that via our website. And what we found in terms of stigma specifically was actually that many disabled individuals in both countries are experiencing increased rates of stigma during COVID-19. So the example I'm giving from Kenya is 39%. And when we delve into the qual data, we see three themes emerging. So some participants are considering COVID policies ableist themselves. So I've given the example of how is somebody supposed to transfer from a wheelchair while social distancing. So others are finding stigma from explicit stigma from non-disabled people, either because non-disabled people are thinking disabled people cannot follow hygiene standards, or because non-disabled people are confusing physiological symptoms of certain impairments with COVID-19 symptoms, and that's leading to stigma and discrimination. Next slide, please. So in sum, I just want to reflect how far we've come in terms of innovation in stigma research. So researchers, as I showed on the first couple of slides, they used to jump through hoops to design research that didn't involve disabled people. Very innovative research, but it didn't involve disabled people. And that wasn't, I think, through explicit prejudice, that it's likely as a function that there was less disabled people around them in the research environments to say, hey, that there's another way because of the other barriers like infrastructure barriers. But now when we speak about innovation, it's more likely to be towards research design that looks at stigma from the perspective of both majority and minority groups, both non-disabled and disabled people, which is crucial. And to support a rights-based perspective, we also need to ensure that stigma research, like any research, is fully inclusive. And in challenging times like COVID-19, especially, we have an innovation mandate there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark. Really interesting just to hear all your reflections and those different areas of research done by yourself and wider across Leonard Cheshire as well. And I think it's really fascinating for me. I think you've really highlighted why stigma is so significant and so important for everybody to be aware of and recognise its impact. And sometimes those impacts are really dependent, I guess, on the area and the topic and the region that work or that research is happening in. And I just wrote down a few words as you were talking that came across really strongly to me, and that was the kind of miscommunications. And I think that's really fascinating, that actually two people in the same interaction can come across with a completely different perspective of what that interaction was like. And that's something I think myself had never given a huge amount of thought to. So I think that's really fascinating. But also the kind of perceptions between different people and assumptions that I think as people we can all make sometimes. And I think that the importance of being aware of how those miscommunications and perceptions and assumptions can feed into stigma and can impact huge amounts of different areas of work in disability innovation, but also far reaching beyond that as well. So I think that was really interesting. I know we've had a couple of questions around how people can find out a little bit more about your work, Mark. So the presentation and this recording will be available after the session, and we'll also put out some more information, some more links as well. So anyone who wishes to find out a little bit more about some of the areas that Mark has just discussed can do that. So we're just going to move on now to hear from Anastasia. Anastasia, I'll leave you to introduce yourself in a little bit more detail. I'm just talking a little bit about some work around youth and in Kenya.
Great, thank you very much for having me. And just to quickly introduce myself, I'm the head of knowledge and learning at Sujas Inc. I will talk more about Sujas Inc. on the next slide, but generally it's a social venture that's focused on young people aged 15 to 24 in East Africa, specifically Kenya and Tanzania. And what I'm going to talk about is how we approach the issue of disability when it came to young people, working with young people, and specifically shifting norms and behaviors among young people in Kenya, and learning about what shapes the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of young people, and also what contribution can we as Sujas Inc. make into changing the situation. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here's a little bit about Sujas. As I mentioned, it's a social venture. We have several platforms that are youth-centered and geared towards helping young people. Currently, we have 7.5 million young people who follow Sujas in one way or another. That's 56% of all youth in our age group, 15 to 24 in Kenya, 23% in Tanzania currently. One of our leading ventures is Sujas Media Platform. So this is the platform that includes several media channels from analog to digital. And this is the platform that we use for social and behavior change communication. So this is a platform to which we invite young people as a safe space where we can surface sensitive issues, challenges that they face in their everyday life, and then see how we can help them find solutions among themselves. And this is really important for us because we don't want to be the instructors, we don't want to be people who tell youth what to do. We want them to collaborate and partner with each other, regardless what the issue is, and find the challenges that would be genuine to them, so that there is a buy-in and there is an uptake of communication, the norms, the behaviors that are more positive than they used to have before. So for us to be able to do so, we do quite a bit of research, and all of our media campaigns are strongly grounded in all of the research that we've done. And because of this very strong interlink between research and media, and then media and research, when we build the feedback loop and let young people tell us whether we did well with our media or not, based on what we learned from them, we were able to grow the platform. And also along the way, we won quite a few media awards, including two international Emmys. So when we started our partnership with UCL last year, we talked again about doing research, involving our media, but turning this partnership more into a partnership about conversations on what's currently happening with young people with disabilities in Kenya. What's currently happening with young people who are not disabled but interact with young people with disabilities? Is disability on the radar for young people? So we approach it from a perspective of, can can we do our typical traditional research that we would do with any media campaign before we started, formative research, and just understand what's happening in this space. In terms of research that we generally do, we come to it with understanding that we are working with young people. The attention span is very short. Some of the issues we want to discuss with them are extremely sensitive. So it never works asking direct questions. So about 10 years ago, when we just started our social ventures, we invented a sort of a research-focused experience for young people, where they come together and do fun things, entertaining things, but along the way, it helps them to build stronger relationships with our research team, build rapport with the research team, and really surface conversations in a way they would not ask if we just had, let's say, focus groups and ask them direct questions. So we play a lot of games with young people during our research. We make them draw, we make them write poems, we make them dance, we make them play out scenarios, all of that with the goal of creating this space similar to Boal types street theater research, where we invite young people into the space where they have to play out different situations and then themselves analyze what just happened with these situations and why. What it lets us do is we create segmented groups of young people, and we try to understand them in depth and then place them along the rejection adoption scale, where we know which particular segments of young people, for example, are in the resentment rejection space, what they know, how they know, what their social norms are, who are the influence around them, who are the people who are in the adoption space, whether it's normative or behavior adoption, how they got into this space, what is different between those in the rejection and adoption. And then we define and devise the journey for young people in the resentment and rejection space to move forward and join the group with positive behaviors. So moving to the next slide, I have an image of what were the outcomes of our experience with young people that we call ground truth, because it's the truth from the ground. So there are 4 different segments of young people, as you can see. So there is a segment of frowners. So these are young people who are extremely negative about people with disabilities. They are young people with no disabilities. They are the subject of a number of myths, stereotypes, stigma. Overall, they are very resentful of the presence of people with disabilities in their social circle. There is a segment of profilers, which includes both young people with and without disabilities. And this is the group that are not necessarily negative, but they do profile each other. People with disabilities profile young people without disabilities, and the other way around, and they adjust their behavior accordingly in a very visible way that makes both of them very uncomfortable. There is a segment of comrades, young people who engage with, so both young people with and without disabilities who engage in a very positive manner, in a normalized manner. And there is a group of supporters who, again, are young people without disabilities who try to take a role of supporters, protectors, and enablers for young people with disabilities. And when we were looking at what defines these different segments, we arrived at several factors, but just to highlight 2. So one of the really important factor was whether or not young people were growing up with people with disabilities present in their routine life. So what we found, for example, in Mombasa, young people were telling us that, you know, I go to school and my classmate is disabled, or my teacher is disabled, and I go to church and there is another person I know and I'm quite close with who is disabled. And the same young people with disabilities were telling us, well, we interact in school, we interact in normal everyday routine, we go together here and there. So this presence of young people with disabilities in the everyday context in a positive way were the two factors that kind of defined the attitude of particular segments to people with disabilities and people with disabilities towards young people. So the presence and the visibility and specific context of the visibility, whether it's positive or not. So in contrast, what we found in Nairobi, for example, was that people with disabilities are extremely visible. However, they're visible in a very negative context. So when we ask young people without disabilities to tell us where would they see people with disabilities, they would say, well, those are beggars in the street. They might pretend that they have disabilities so that they can scheme you, they can lie to you, they can get some money out of you. And that also was the factor that, as Mark referred to, that was creating different experience for people with disabilities as well, where they said, I feel like I am taken as a representative of everybody who is a person with disabilities. So if somebody had bad experience with a beggar in the street who happened to be in a wheelchair, then they would say everybody who's in a wheelchair is a really negative person and is out there to get you and to scheme you. So all of these life experiences, the normalization of the presence of people with disabilities in routine life, the positive experience and the positive engagement, the positive context around that seem to be very important. In this regard, for example, what we realized that frowners were most likely to be found in rural and deep rural areas. So these are young people with a lot of resentment and stigma against people with disabilities. Because of the mere fact that in rural areas, disabilities, especially in the areas with young people which we interacted with, was perceived as a curse, something that can spread to other people in the community. So generally, you would not see people with disabilities being out and about. They're usually hidden in the house, so nobody knows, because having one person with disability in the house affect everybody else in the household. So the girls wouldn't get married, for example, the boys wouldn't be able to find a job because of this fear, stigma, and myth. So based on that, then our approach was that, thank you very much. Our approach was that we want to focus on two segments. We want to focus on frowners, the young people who are not exposed with people to people with disabilities, and showcase to them the normal everyday life where people with disabilities come as innovators, as experimenters, as creative, as fantastic contributors to the community. And similarly, work with the segment of profilers, both young people with and without disabilities, and showcase to them how they can work together, be together, without trying to extend their first impression about each other for the entire population of young people. So our idea was we want to create comrades and we want to create supporters among our young people. So this is kind of the view of all of the media that we have on the Suggest multimedia platform. So we engaged our comic, SMS platform, events, on the ground events that we were able to do before the COVID, social media pages, and also the network of 3,000 distributors to start telling stories about very innovative, interesting young people who are contributing to their communities, who are part of their the routine lives of their communities, and who are just genuinely great young people. And that involves telling real stories of young people with disabilities, showcasing role models and positive deviants, as well as telling fictional stories. So if we go to the next slide, I have just a snapshot of two stories of two of our fictional characters. So in our story world, in the Suggest comic, and then throughout social media, we have one character character, which is girl Sifa. And Sifa is an agricultural innovator. So everybody comes to Sifa in their community. She's a rural girl, and everybody comes to her because her garden is consistently flourishing, and she is making really good money from her agricultural hustle. So what we do in our stories, we don't focus on the fact that Sifa is a young lady with disabilities. We focus on her skills and her contribution, showcasing how Sifa is actually a great hustler, and everyone can learn that she's a great hustler, and she's happy to teach everybody. So the whole fact that she is disabled is not that important in the story. However, it's in the background. It creates this normalization of Sifa being present in all of the activities with her friends, but Sifa also being really good at something that her friends are not. And another character who is Laro. Laro is an albino, and he is part of our life story in a slightly different world, where he is going on a date with one of our quite popular character, the lady. And what happens during the date is that they see a little boy drowning in the pond, and Lara jumps in and saves the little kid from the pond. So again, the discussion is around Lara being a really great gentleman, taking his girl on a date and showcasing how great their relationships are, but also presenting Lara as a really cool guy who can save a kid and contribute to the community this way. So overall, this is our approach, our research and our approach in talking to very specific groups of young people, knowing very specific roots of their misconceptions, stigma, and kind of worried attitude towards each other, and then retelling their stories in comic stories through either fictional characters or real life young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My voice back. Thank you so much, Anastasia. That was really, really interesting and amazing to see some of those fantastic graphics and approaches that you've taken. I find it really interesting that the absolute core to a lot of your work is putting the youth at the heart of creating and designing that content itself, and really driving it so that I guess the output is really, really targeted to your target audience, but also they are very much involved in shaping of that, and how that really supports in breaking down some of those issues and barriers and I guess their perceptions that they may have kind of been formed through their environment and through their potentially kind of quite limited life experience, and how actually through this a really creative, really dynamic and quite an innovative approach, you can challenge some of those in almost quite a subconscious way. So I think that's really fascinating, and I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about all that work, and I'm sure lots of other people will be as well, so we can make sure we share some links and some information.
Absolutely,
so,
thank you.
Thank you. So I'll now hand across to my colleague Julia. I'll let Julia introduce herself and talk to us a little bit around assistive technology and stigma and looking at identity.
Hi everyone. So if you speak BSL, I sincerely apologize for the particularly bad quality of my signing. If you don't speak BSL, what I just did was I introduced myself. I said that my name was Julia and that my sign language name, it's indicated with this sign. The reason for it is because if you really have met me at any stage, regardless of weather condition, day or night, indoor, outdoor, there's a very good chance I'll be wearing sunglasses on my head. It's a habit that I picked up many years ago and it kind of like stuck with me. This is a very simple example of how a relatively minor detail of my physical appearance influences my identity so much that my sign language name kind of picked it up. this is a really common thing. It happens to all of us all the time. How we introduce ourselves, how we present ourselves, the way we look has a huge impact on how people perceive us, but also a lot of time on how we perceive ourselves. Unfortunately, though, this is almost never considered when it comes to assistive technology design. Assistive technology are designed for functions. They're created to build a functional gap between the capability of the person and the capabilities that are required to complete a certain task in a certain environment, usually in a certain way that it's dictated by mainstream society. Now, I'm very familiar with function, and actually I'm very fond of it in many respects. Before becoming researchers, I was actually a physio, and I worked on wheelchair services for several years, which is why I was really excited in 2019 when I got asked to work on the Innovate Project with colleagues from Motivation. And next slide, please. So the Innovate Project, it's based around the idea of combining digital manufacturing techniques, things like computer modeling and 3D printing, with traditional manufacturing to create customized bespoke wheelchairs for clients in Kenya. This is huge and it has the potential of being revolutionary. And I was like really excited by this project. And our assumption is that having access to these customized wheelchairs will give people much relative advantage. So they would be able to do more things than they were with their regular wheelchair, and they will be able to do them better. So function is really what we had in mind when I designed a research protocol to evaluate this project. And yes, we used both quantitative methods, so things like wheelchair skills test, but also qualitative methods such as interview. But what we were really after was really around what advantage in practice does this wheelchair give? One thing is that everyone that I worked with on this project and everyone that participated to it really was hugely invested on it, which is why the most disappointing moment of all came bang in the middle of it. Next slide. The most disappointed moment for me was happened with Salome. Salome was one of the participants of our studies. She was super excited about the project. She came over, got her assessment done, and then she went home. We made her wheelchair just for her, came back 2 weeks later. She transferred on the wheelchair and the wheelchair broke. So as you might be able to see from the picture on the left-hand side with the red circle, as soon as she transferred on it, on one of the 3D printed joints, very close to the rear left back wheel, a very, very small crack developed. Unfortunately, that it's sufficient to make the wheelchair unsafe. So we weren't able to let her test it properly. She had to transfer back to her own wheelchair, and that was it. Regardless of it, we decided to do the closing interview anyway. And honestly, I have to admit, I was massively looking forward to do it. Generally, interviewing participants is one of my favorite parts of my job. It's something that I really like to do. Interviewing a very disappointed participant, especially when you feel somehow responsible for the failure, it's really not a particularly pleasant experience. But next slide, please. But what it emerged from it during our interview was that she actually loved the project. And for the life of me, I could not figure out why. Initially, I thought she was trying to be nice. Unfortunately, sometimes happen. People try to give you the responses that they think you want, not really what they think. So because of that, I started to prod a little bit deeper and see exactly why did she like it, because in my eyes, her experience was a complete letdown. And as we were talking, she said this: getting my wheelchair made me think of going to a tailor. A tailor will fit the clothing according to my body, according to my style, according to my taste. So I like this about a wheelchair as well. I like that I get asked what color do I want it. To me, it matters so much. It's not just a sitting thing. I want a chair that when I use it, when I get to places, it doesn't make me look miserable. I don't want to look miserable because I'm not miserable. So when she came up with this, I was a bit thunderstruck, genuinely. And after we wrapped up our interview, I went back and looked at all the other interviews that we did before as part of the project. And surprise, the same theme kept emerging over and over again. I just didn't see it before because I wasn't looking for it. And what it emerged, it's that function, yes, was important. And there were loads of accounts of people telling us what the wheelchair did well, what they didn't do well, what it had to improve. But what caused them to really buy into the idea and being really enthusiastic about this project was the fact that the way the wheelchair was made allowed them to self-express their identity through their assistive technology. Next slide. So really, in the end, we decided that this was something that we had to look at in more details. So at the very end of the project, we got all the users that took part in it to come together and do a group interview specifically around this. And what they told us, it's that function was crucial for wheelchairs. You use wheelchairs to go around, so having them working well is important. But what they strongly believed is that function could be something that can be iteratively improved through design, and that it can get better over time. What can't get better over time, what is either there from the beginning or it isn't, it's the principle of being able to affirm your identity, to self-express yourself through your wheelchair. And that you only get through an approach that allows you to personalize as you go. That can be retrofitted. It's either there or it isn't. Ultimately, the thing that all our participants said is that until we acknowledge that it's fundamentally important for assistive technology to enable the people that use them to present themselves, to look and to feel the way they wanted, what we're gonna provide, it's technology that project the wrong image about people. And that's really ultimately, in their opinion, what Stigma, it's really all about. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Julian, for sharing those stories. And I think what's really interesting there is that actually the output that you had from that experience was quite different to, I guess, what you were going into expecting, and the type of feedback and the type of response you were anticipating from the testing of that assistive technology. And obviously that huge importance of the sense of self and choice and options. And I think that really aligns with Stigma, not just for assistive technology, but through lots of different areas, and really shows where, I guess, kind of innovation and design and culture and art can come together and can start challenging some of those elements of stigma, and why recognizing that some of these areas can be real barriers is really important in all the work that we're doing. So Thank you so much for that. We're coming to the end now of our panelist sessions, but we've had lots of questions come through on the Q&A and the chat box. So thank you everybody for your inputs. There's been quite a lot of people asking about how they can find out more information and get more involved and discuss some ideas further. So we'll provide some more information after the session on some options for that. But I just want to answer a few of the questions directly. So I'm going to just pick up a couple of them and ask our panelists to come back with some responses. So one of them we had that, Vicky, I'm gonna come to you first for, was how should we and how could we go about really lighting the spark of innovation in this area around stigma within disabled communities themselves?
Thanks. I think I just tried to answer that in words. So it's my experience that when disabled communities are able to be listened to, often that innovation is already lit. Oftentimes disabled people shouldn't have to, but especially in lower resource settings, do have to be very, very innovative and creative in terms of solutions finding. I think oftentimes the barrier is the willingness of those with resources and decision-making power to actually listen to that group of people. And so one of the ways we've been successful given time has been to enable spaces for disabled people in those settings to come together and actually be collective around their aims. One example, I'm working in Sierra Leone at the moment with DPU at UCL, and we found disabled people living in some communities who hadn't actually spoken with each other collectively, never mind collectively articulated their aims and their goals, and once they met together they were able to have much more recognition from the community. And actually some of those people told me that access to assistive technology was a secondary concern to them. Being able to be active participants and belong in their community free of stigma was their primary concern. So as an example, that's somewhere we've been working to address it.
Wonderful, thank you, Vicky. I am aware of time. We've just gone slightly past 2 o'clock, but I'm just going to ask a couple of questions for our other panel members, just so that we've addressed some of the brilliant questions that have come from yourselves as audience members. So Mark, it'd be great to come to you. We've had quite a lot of people really interested in hearing a little bit more and reading some more on your research. And one of the questions came through was should people or could people best go about involving disabled people, particularly where there might be restrictions on projects to do with things like time or resource? Do you have any kind of advice or guidance on what you think is the best approach?
Thanks, Louise. I tried to get at that a bit in the chat box. Sorry, I'll turn my video on as well. So I think that it needs to vary context to context in terms of the approach to involving disabled people. But I think a key starting point that is to actually have that conversation at the outset, to actually ask disabled people and prospective partners how they would like to be involved in research. And I also think a very important process for that is the process of reflection. So to the end of at the end of partnerships or at important points, make sure that the process of reflection is built in. What has worked well in terms of inclusion and what has not, and where are the bottlenecks. And I did post in the chat, I think UNICEF have just released a brochure, a guide that talks about some of this as well that people might like to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that was a very big question to ask when we're already over time, but it's just good to get a bit of a perspective from yourself on that. Anastasia, we've had a few people just asking around if you think it might be possible for people to, I guess, recreate or take learnings from some of the approach you've made in terms of the engagement of young people within Africa, whether you think that that's a model that could work in other places, potentially in Africa and beyond. And I guess also we've had the question of whether kind of a lot of the work you're doing is based around this concept of, I guess, a kind of positive normalization of people with disabilities, and whether you think that that's kind of, I guess, a summary of what you do, or if there's a different way you describe it.
So I think I just responded to that question. I think it's not necessarily just positive normalization of people with disabilities, because what we want to achieve is not to say that people with disabilities deserve special treatment, because that's again putting people with disabilities separate from everybody else. What we want to normalize is interactions among people regardless whether they have disabilities or not, so that that's the reason we embed characters with disabilities across our Sujas world, rather than create separate story where we just tell the story of Sifa, for example, and her life. But Sifa appears in the life of all of our characters, and it's kind of just a normal presence in there. So I think, yes, it is positive normalization, but not of people, rather interaction among people regardless what their personal characteristics might be. And with regards to the engagement with young people, so as I mentioned, we do work in Kenya and Tanzania specifically. These are kind of our home markets, but we also tried this engagement, the experience with young people, research-focused experience in Uganda went really well. We got reports from young people in Uganda and Cameroon that they received our Kenyan comic from some of their friends. They couldn't understand what's in the dialogues. They understood the stories though. They really wanted to us to try and bring the comic and the platform to their countries. We're thinking about Rwanda, so we think that there is a potential of taking Sujas to other countries. We're just not sure which specific countries, and COVID-19 kind of derailed us in our thinking a little bit. But yes, that's definitely has been on our radar, that would be an interesting and beneficial venture. So if there are specific suggestions, and we can discuss. We're happy to be discussing.
Wonderful, thank you for that. So Julia, just as we're starting to close, I think we'll just come to you with one final question before we kind of wrap up the session. So we had a few people question around, I guess it's that idea that kind of assistive technology, AT, has the real ability within itself to potentially reduce stigma, but also beyond the actual just product, actually what might be the opportunities wider, so within the service and the delivery of that, not just for assistive technology, but maybe wider for other products and design services. So it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective on what the opportunities might be there. You're on mute, Julia.
Yeah, there you go. I've been like, you think I would have learned over about like, I don't know how many months of virtual meeting in COVID, but apparently I did not learn anything about unmuting yourself myself when I speak. You're definitely right. There is huge opportunities on service delivery, and if anything, actually, service deliveries and how assistive technologies are provided is what makes a difference. Because a lot of time things can be provided as part of a process. And in order to capture even what the person wants from an assistive technology in terms of affirming their personal identity, expressing themselves, or even modify according to their preferences, the way they're seen and perceived by others. That's really has to start on how technologies are distributed, how people come in contact with them. At the moment, there is a very top-down approach where your possibilities of choices are very limited. And the best that we can hope from a lot of it is to make things as unobtrusive as possible. I am not very fond of this idea of unobtrusiveness, because it almost passes the message that there is something to hide, something that doesn't have to be that visible. In reality, you have to give people the choice of having something unobtrusive if they want, because in certain contexts, that's how they might want to be perceived. But in others, they might actually wish to be very visible, and they might want to push up their identity, and they will have to be given the instruments to do so, but in the way they want. And that can only be baked in the service delivery. It cannot just be there in the device alone.
Thank you, Julia. I think that's been really interesting, and it's been really fascinating just hearing from all the panelists on today's sessions. So a huge thank you to everybody for taking the time and joining, but a massive thank you for all of you joining from around the world. And we know we've got people from all over the place on the webinar today. So we're really grateful. It's been fantastic to hear some of your questions and some of the work that you've been doing as well. We just wanted to let you know before we wrap up that our next Disability Innovation live session will take place on the 17th of September, and that session will be looking at product narratives, and that's really taking a look in a bit more depth at specific assistive technology products such as eyeglasses and prosthetics, and looking at the challenges of supply and demand side barriers for priority assistive technology. So we'll be hearing from some real experts in that area about how we can and what the potential is to improve access globally for those key assistive technology products and bits of equipment. So before we wrap up for today, I'll maybe just hand back to Vicky just to see if she wants to finish off with any final words of wisdom around disability, stigma and innovation. I think today's been a fascinating discussion with lots of really different perspectives and experiences. But I think, Vicky, it would be really good to hear if you've kind of got one takeaway for everyone just to kind of go away and think about as a learning from today, and how we can take this forward.
Of course. A couple of things. The power of young people to drive change, how important it is to focus on the next generation, which rang true in London too. The importance of stories and telling those stories ourselves and enabling others to tell their own stories. And the importance of participation, especially in the way we envisage things like research. And then finally, the power of technology to drive change. So I'll probably come back to where I started, which is let's build the fire so that we can take every opportunity to light it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody. That's the end of our Disability Innovation Live for now, and we hope to see you all in September for our next session. Bye.